Hello everyone, and welcome to week 10 of Poll 101, American National Government. This week we'll be discussing interest groups, seedy underbelly of American politics, or an integral mechanism of pluralism and representation. Now before we begin, don't forget that you've got another extra credit opportunity this week to earn up to 3 points of extra credit on your final grade. Details for the assignment are provided in the Week 10 module, and you must complete the assignment by Friday, 11:59 p.m. to receive credit. So today marks the first lecture of Unit 3, American Political Institutions, and today we'll be discussing special interest groups and lobbying. Over the next 4 weeks, we will cover each of America's political institutions in detail, including Congress, the presidency, the bureaucracy, and the judiciary. The final week of class will be reserved for exam review, and then we will wrap up the course with the third and final exam on the last day of class, December 16th. Overall, you guys have been doing an excellent job in class, keeping up with the assignments and getting really great marks on all of your assignments, so just keep up the good work, and this class will be wrapped up in about a month. And as always, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to email me, and with all that being said, let's go ahead and get started. So by the end of this lecture, you'll be able to define interest groups and articulate the differences between interest groups and political parties. You'll also be able to identify different types of interest groups and whether they're motivated by private, public, or ideological interests. And we'll also spend some time talking about the different types of activities that interest groups engage in and how they influence government, such as lobbying, electoral activities, and the pivotal role PACs and super PACs play in determining who gets what, when, and how. So I want you to think back to the political parties lecture and think about the definition that was given for political parties, because there's a lot of overlap between the primary objectives of parties and interest groups. So political parties can be understood as an organized coalition of interests that seek to influence government and policy by getting members elected to public office. Interest groups, quite similarly, are an organized coalition of interests that seek to influence government and policy, but by petitioning and educating elected officials on specific issues. Unlike the two major political parties, interest groups in the United States are relatively small and typically organized around a discrete set of issues. So while parties structure the institutions of government, such as the committee system in Congress, interest groups petition government as outsiders. And while parties structure the electoral system through candidate recruitment, control over the nomination process, and influence over the rules of the electoral game, interest groups work at the grassroots level to educate voters, raise money, and increase awareness on their respective issues. The relationship between interest groups and parties is much like a sports analogy. The two major parties are the opposing teams in politics, and interest groups are their biggest fans. They make large donations of time and resources to the parties. They try to influence the direction and decision-making of parties, and they try to recruit the best players to run as candidates under party banners. Nonetheless, interest groups are not parties, and they must rely on parties and candidates to win the game. So what are the key differences between interest groups and political parties? Well, here's a few facts that I'd like you to keep in mind. Interest groups are designed to advocate for narrow and specific interests. Now, because politicians have to represent very different and diverse constituencies, they often don't have expert-level knowledge on every single issue facing their district. So this is where interest groups step in and help educate politicians on how they think they should legislate. Broadly speaking, the purpose of interest groups is to influence elected officials and educate voters on specific issues. Political parties, on the other hand, their main objective is getting candidates elected, specifically those who will represent the party well, and help achieve partisan objectives. So let's dive into the differences within interest groups. A key way to differentiate among interest groups is to categorize them as either private or public interests. Private interests refer to those that benefit select individuals or groups without benefiting the whole. And in the case of democracy, that would be society. So this includes businesses, labor, professional, and trade associations. These groups seek to secure economic or monetary benefits for their members. benefits that are not generally available to non-members. So, for example, the American Federation of Labor and Congress of Industrial Organizations, or the AFL-CIO, works in support of stronger labor laws for its union members. So you have to be a member to reap the benefits. Public interests, on the other hand, benefit the whole, and again, that means society. So not just select individuals or groups in society. And the key difference here is that everyone in society benefits from the action of public interest groups, even if they're not a member of the group, because the types of policies that they try to achieve directly benefit everyone in society. So the Sierra Club is a really great example of a public interest group. It draws attention to issues concerning the environment, such as finding clean energy solutions and limiting greenhouse emissions. So even if you're not a member of the Sierra Club and you don't pay your dues, we all benefit from policies that make our air cleaner and our water clearer. And often within the realm of public interest groups, though they can sometimes be private as well, we also have various ideological interest groups, which, like it sounds, is primarily interested in promoting ideological or issue-specific agendas. So for instance, the National Abortion and Reproductive Rights Action League is united by a common concern for women's reproductive rights. In particular, the group is focused on protecting access to abortion procedures for women. Conversely, you also have the National Right to Life interest group, which is one of the oldest and largest anti-abortion interest groups in the United States. And the National Rifle Association, or NRA, is another example of an issue-specific interest group that works to protect all Americans' Second Constitutional Amendment right. And by the way, if you're not familiar with this, the NRA has some of the best Christmas cards ever, so I highly encourage you to check these out on Google. And finally, there's quite a few religious-oriented interest groups that seek to represent religious institutions and values, such as the Christian Coalition and the National Association of Evangelicals. And while there's generally a lot of negative connotations associated with interest groups, which we will talk about in far more detail in a moment, one thing worth keeping in mind is that interest groups play a pivotal role in our society. And they serve as a crucial mechanism that helps individuals with narrow or specific issue agendas bring these matters to the attention of the broader, more generalist political parties. In fact, I dare you to find an interest that is not represented by an official interest group. There's the United States Association of Reptile Keepers. There's the Balloon Council. And who could forget the American Dehydrated Onion and Garlic Association? So the point is that there literally is an interest group for every interest. Now, let's shift to a conversation on how interest groups actually work to influence government. Lobbying, which you've probably heard of, is the most fundamental role that interest groups play in a democracy. Lobbying is the political activity that aims to influence government policymaking, and those who engage in lobbying are known as lobbyists. So lobbying is one of the main tactics that interest groups use to pressure the government concerning policy development, but what exactly does that mean? Well, one way to think of it is that lobbyists are essentially professional protesters. So just as protesters gather with signs and slogans outside of Capitol Hill to convey messages to national policymakers, lobbyists use power and influence, and mostly money is what we're talking about here, to persuade and influence policymakers. The primary function of lobbyists is to provide current and meaningful information to government officials. In doing so, they serve to educate lawmakers and staff on their issues. Lobbyists also distill this information into talking points for lawmakers in order to influence the way in which issues are presented and discussed within Congress and before the public at large. Similarly, they offer legislative language to steer the shape that policy takes in committee rooms and on the floor of the House and Senate. And finally, in order to have an impact on the rules and regulations developed to assist in policy implementation, lobbyists try to forge relationships with executive agencies and bureaucratic staff. So these are all factors that we will discuss in more detail in the Congress chapter, the presidency chapter, the bureaucracy chapter, talking about the role that lobbyists play throughout our government. But however, lobbying activities are not exclusively reserved to petitioning government officials. In fact, there are a variety of activities interest groups engage in with the purpose of educating and mobilizing voters and informing the public on specific policies or issues. Many interest groups also keep track of the voting records of individual members of Congress on select issues. So, for example, the American Civil Liberties Union, or the ACLU, tracks congressional votes and scores the percentage of time each member of Congress voted with or against a stated ACLU position. So let's take this first bill for example. This was a bill that sought to repeal a rule that required the Social Security Administration to report disabled recipients to the Attorney General and for them to be added to the National Instant Criminal Background Check System. And the primary motivation here was to identify Social Security recipients who were deemed incompetent or suffer from mental illness as individuals who pose a threat or danger to themselves or others, and thus lacking the mental capacity to manage their own personal affairs. And all of this was done in order to potentially prohibit such individuals from purchasing or owning firearms. Now, the ACLU was in support of repealing this rule. And if we return to the scorecard, we can see the senators who voted for the repeal, denoted by the letter O, and the senators who voted against the repeal, denoted by X. And not surprisingly, we see pretty clear partisan divisions on the vote. So this type of scorecard is a really helpful resource that helps voters determine if their senators are voting with or against their interests. And they're also commonly used in campaign advertisements when political opponents want to highlight a candidate's failed or contradictory voting track record. On a different note, a highly controversial activity of interest groups that you've probably heard of is the formation of something called a Political Action Committee, or PAC. PACs are organizations established by individuals or private groups with the aim of raising money to contribute directly to candidates for elective office. And PACs have been around since about the 1940s, so they're certainly nothing new. But where it gets interesting is, depending on the size of the group, PACs can raise large sums of money to contribute to the campaigns of like-minded candidates. Now, I'm not super concerned that you know every little detail of this chart here, but over the last several decades, there's been significant reforms on who can give what. Notice that there are vast regulations on how much individuals can donate to candidates, PACs, and national parties. And also notice the similar regulations placed on PACs and national party committees as well. But where it gets really interesting is when we start looking at regulations on super PACs. And note that the primary difference between PACs and super PACs is that PACs organize to donate money directly to a candidate. Super PACs, on the other hand, operate under the premise that they raise money independently and do not directly coordinate with parties or campaigns. In other words, all of the money super PACs raise are for advocacy purposes, and there are absolutely no limits on the amount of money super PACs can spend on independent advocacy. And if you recall from the Campaigns and Elections lecture last week, we talked about how the court decision in Citizens United versus FEC struck down provisions of the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act that banned political advertising by corporations. Now, according to the Supreme Court, corporate spending on political advertising is now considered a protected right under the First Amendment of freedom of expression. In other words, spending equals speech. And that ruling has had dramatic consequences for how powerful groups support and advocate for specific political campaigns. The ruling in Citizens United is directly responsible for the creation of super PACs, independent political action committees that may raise unlimited sums of money from corporations, unions, and individuals. But it is not permitted to contribute or coordinate directly with parties or campaigns. So what's the big deal with super PACs? They can't contribute directly to campaigns or parties, so why does it matter? Well, the answer depends on whether you believe a deluge of corporate dollars in American elections stymies the democratic process or not. Today, just 11 donors, a bipartisan collection of hedge fund billionaires, entrepreneurs, media magnates, and a casino mogul, have contributed more than 1/5 of the total $4.5 billion collected by super PACs since their inception in 2010. Now, this intense concentration of money shows how just a tiny group of super rich individuals has embraced these political groups, which have emerged as indispensable allies of candidates and political parties. Super PAC money plays such a powerful role in influencing politics that the Republican primary is now jokingly referred to by political insiders as the Adelson primary. Over the last decade, Republican presidential candidates line up at Sheldon Adelson's door in hopes of clinching his endorsement, because it comes along with an influx of tens of millions of dollars to support their campaigns. So at the end of the day, we have to ask ourselves, do our politicians represent us, the people, or the mega donors who hold the future of their political viability in their wallets? So now you have some who argue that interest groups aren't all that bad. In fact, some suggest that it's just a broad misconception that interest groups attempt to buy influence or votes in Congress. Interest groups often do contribute money to political campaigns, but they tend to focus on only those candidates who would otherwise support their cause. In other words, these organizations do not buy off their enemies, they sponsor their friends. They use money to help those who are already ideologically aligned with their cause and thus most likely to bring about the changes they seek in government. So rather than buying votes, interest group money buys access. And as politicians are more inclined to spend time with those who have financially contributed to their election, it's in their best interest to do so. So take gun rights groups, for example. Republican candidates have received much more support from gun rights groups than have Democratic candidates. And that's not surprising, right? Democrats are typically the ones who support stricter laws regulating firearms. So why would these groups give money to Democrats? We see a similar pattern with the business sector donations. Unsurprisingly, business-oriented groups are significantly less likely to donate to Democratic candidates because Democrats often advocate for stricter regulations on businesses. There's also significant cleavages among educational sectors who are significantly more likely to donate to Democratic candidates because Democrats are the ones who typically advocate for increased government spending on education. Almost every issue you look at, you'll see a similar partisan division when it comes to following the money. So overall, is lobbying and special interest groups and super PAC contributions all just politics as usual? Or is all of this indicative of something a bit more nefarious? And we're going to explore this in a lot more detail next week when we talk about Congress and the role that lobbyists play in pushing through legislation. So for now, let's consider the recap. Interest groups allow for the representation of diverse interests, from the pressing matters facing members of the Balloon Coalition, all the way to those who fight for clean air and clean water and lobby Congress to take action on climate change. Interest groups are a key component of American politics that allow the people to bring the issues that matter most to them directly to government. Interest groups also allow advocates to inform generalist politicians on narrow policy issues. I mean, without the prune lobby, who would have known that prune patties offer a delicious and affordable plant-based alternative to traditional hamburgers? Yum! Doesn't that look delicious? And overall, we know interest groups play a pivotal role in mobilizing and educating both voters and politicians on important issues. On the other hand, though, there's certainly no dearth of examples when it comes to the more negative implications of interest groups. And as we'll see next week, interest groups can obstruct the policy-making process by threatening to withhold campaign contributions if congressmen don't vote the way big interests want on certain bills. Those with the most resources, i.e. money, have a disproportionate influence in government, and together this chips away at our trust in government and fosters a belief that the government doesn't work for the people. It works for big interests. All right, I'm sorry that we kind of ended on a more dreary note. I try to not make that happen, but that's all I really got for you guys on this week's lecture. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you learned something new. And as always, stay healthy, stay safe, and thanks for watching.